Good afternoon, and welcome to the webinar on highway spending in Nebraska. This webinar is presented by the Bureau of Business Research, which is part of the Department of Economics within the College of Business Administration here at UNL. My name is Eric Thompson. I'm the director of the Bureau of Business Research, and I'm also an economist that works quite a bit on highway infrastructure and how it affects the economy and the finance of highway infrastructure and so forth. So I've been looking forward to this presentation and this webinar here today to talk about some of our recent research results on that topic. I wanted to mention a few things about the webinar before we get started. Our main presentation will be a PowerPoint presentation, and you can see that PowerPoint in the large window on the left-hand side of your screen. There's also a number of smaller windows on the right-hand side of the screen. In the center right part of your screen, you'll see a list of participants in the webinar, and that may change as a few more people add on here as time passes. But you have the ability to have a chat conversation with some of the other webinar participants if you'd like. And in fact, the chat window is just below in the lower right-hand part of your screen. You can see that the Bureau of Business Research has already posted a few chat points, and you can send a chat comment to everyone, but you can also send it to individual people when you look at the list of participants. So I'd encourage you to do that during the webinar. If you have any points you would like to make, or just say hi to someone you know. Another thing we have is a question and answer window. So that's in the lower center part of your screen. We'll, just for the flow of the webinar, we'll be answering questions at the end of the webinar when the PowerPoint presentation is complete. But you should feel like you're free to type a question at any time during the webinar. You can be first on the list if you type your question as it occurs to you during the presentation. And of course, it's just fine for people to type their questions at the end of the presentation as well. The last feature we have with our webinars is a polling question of webinar participants. So each webinar we have 2 or 3 poll questions we ask during the course of the webinar to get your opinion or your expectations about the topic at hand. And we're going to have 2 such poll questions here today in this webinar on highway spending in Nebraska. In fact, the first poll question is already posted, and that window is in the upper center part of the screen. I'll also have a reminder a little bit later on to encourage you to go ahead and fill out the first poll question. Well, with all those points made, I'm going to go ahead and proceed with the PowerPoint presentation, the main part of the webinar. I should also, I want to thank the U.S. Department of Transportation and Micropolitan LLC. Some of the information, or quite a bit of the information we'll be presenting in the webinar was part of a research project that we did with Micropolitan LLC for the U.S. Department of Transportation. So happy to present this information to you today. By way of outline, here's the main points we're going to be covering during the webinar over this noon half hour. First of all, we're going to look at the issue of highway transportation or highway construction spending versus highway construction investment, and the sort of slightly different or somewhat different definitions you would give to those two terms. We're going to look at trends in the transportation tax base, trends including here in Nebraska. We're going to look at trends in highway spending from around the country. And then lastly, we're going to look at the issue, is highway spending, does it meet the definition of investment? So those are the 4 topics we're going to cover here today. First, let's talk about the definition of highway spending. Highway spending refers to all dollars allocated to pay for highway construction projects. So in other words, all of the spending, I think, is reasonable to consider just that, to be just that, spending. I think the key point is the purpose of highway spending. The purpose of highway spending is variable, not fixed, and it's defined according to the preferences of decision makers. So that could be the Department of Transportation in a state. It could be a local or regional committee that participates in transportation investment decisions. It could be the legislature, it could be the governor in a state. Whoever those decision makers are, whatever their priorities are, determines what the highway spending or how it's allocated, what types of projects are chosen. Just to give an example, decision makers in a particular state may believe there's insufficient spending on rural highway construction or highway construction if not enough bridges meet current engineering standards. In that case, they may feel it's very important to spend more on that, helping bridges upgrade. The decision makers in a state may feel it's inappropriate if per capita spending on highway construction is lower in rural areas than it is urban areas. So they may want to choose to change spending to equilibrate the two. So the key point here is highway spending meets the preferences of the decision maker, whatever those may be. By contrast, highway investment has a much more precise and fixed economic meaning. Highway investments are those highway construction projects that yield benefits to the public, primarily safer, faster, and less expensive travel, which are large enough that in present value terms they exceed the costs of the project. So if a highway spending project, whatever its purpose, meets that definition, generates sufficient public benefits in terms of safety and the ease and the speed of travel to warrant the amount of money invested, then that highway spending project can be referred to as highway investment. So the differences in these definitions can be pretty important when you're trying to think about the amount of money we spend on highways. Do we have enough highway investment is a frequent question that's asked. And I think when you answer that question, do you really mean investment, or are you referring to spending in general? And you get different answers depending on whether you're referring to spending in general or to investment itself. Okay, with that background, then let's start to look at some of the other issues. What I have here, and I'm starting with some information for the U.S. as a whole, is data over a recent period on annual growth in the highway transportation tax base. So these are the taxed items that are taxed generating revenue for transportation spending. We look at the period 2007 to 2013. 2013, at the time this project was done, was the most recent year for which complete relevant data was available. And so we chose that as our end year. And 2007 was chosen as the beginning year because that's the year that was right before the onset of the Great Recession, or the Great Recession is said to have started in December of 2007, so very late during that year. So anyway, this is a period that encompassed the Great Recession of late 2007 to mid-2009, and then also encompassed the beginning of the recovery from that recession. Although, as many have noted, the recovery from that recession was modest and slow rather than rapid. Anyway, let's go ahead and look at some of these key findings. These are national aggregates here. You can see that population growth in the U.S. Kind of went along a little slower than normally, but during the hard economic times, there was a little bit of a reduction in immigration to the country. Birth rates dropped somewhat. All of these things are common during a severe recession. But generally speaking, population growth was pretty steady and just a bit slower than during normal economic times. However, real per capita income, the increase in our standard of living, was not present during the 2007 to 2013 period. So across the United States, real inflation-adjusted per capita income was unchanged between 2007 and 2013. So that's kind of another indicator that we're talking about a recession and recovery period, not a period that was marked only by economic expansion. So in such a period, you might expect some struggle, some weakness in the growth of the tax base, including the transportation tax base, and you sure see evidence of it here in this slide. There's sort of two main components to the transportation tax base. There's taxed motor fuel volume, in other words, the amount of gasoline and diesel that is sold and taxed each year. And then there's the number of vehicles, because there's vehicle registration fees and other fees, especially associated with trucking-related fees. So the count of the increase in the number of vehicles is also an important part of the transportation tax base. What you see is the number of vehicles barely budged, kind of like real per capita income, very little change in the total number of registered vehicles. And there is actually a significant drop in taxed motor fuel volume. Again, I think that's the weak economy, and then also just the fact that fuel efficiency was rising during this period. And that's a phenomenon that's likely to continue in the future. I know there's been some rollback in regulation just announced and planned in terms of fuel efficiency, but because of technology, because of ongoing social commitments to increase fuel efficiency in vehicles, there is going to be quite a bit of pressure on the growth of tax motor fuel volume and the transportation tax base in the years to come. Now, let's look at the Nebraska data. We know that Nebraska's economy did relatively well during the Great Recession and the period of recovery that occurred afterwards, and that's reflected. I have the same four concepts as we had in the last slide. I just put them in number form instead of graph form. And you can see population grew by 0.8% from 2007 to 2013 in Nebraska. I think here in Nebraska, anytime we're able to match the U.S. population growth rate, we're pretty happy. That's a good outcome for us, and we were able to do it during this period. Now, you see a real difference in terms of real per capita income growth. We actually had strong real per capita income growth during this period rather than no growth. And you see the difference, don't you, in the transportation tax base. Vehicle registrations actually grew by 1% per year in Nebraska during this period. And tax motor vehicle volume, rather than shrinking 0.7% per year, grew by 0.7% per year. So the transportation tax base has been growing quite solidly in Nebraska, and that should have underpinned pretty solid growth in transportation spending in our state during the period as well, especially since in recent years we've introduced or earmarked new revenue for transportation. Some of the state general fund relatively recently has been reallocated over to transportation spending, and we've also recently increased our gasoline tax. Okay. Now, if you think about some of the other states in the country that haven't been quite as fortunate as us in terms of their economy and their transportation tax base recently, or if you think about Nebraska and whether we might want to continue to expand our transportation tax base, what are some of the best options to do that, according to some of our research? Well, we've settled on four options. The first would be to increase motor fuel tax rates. If you do an analysis of motor fuel tax rates and you compare that to some of the externalities generated by motor vehicle use, there seems to be potential for further increases in motor fuel tax rates. Now, let me give you a little bit of background to all that. Vehicle operation generates quite a few things that economists call externalities. These are effects on other drivers, other people. So not the costs that you internalize and bear yourself, but effects you might have on other people. So the first of these, and I guess the most obvious of these, is pollution. So we know that internal combustion engines generate pollution, and that has some effect on other parties, particularly people with trouble breathing and so forth. But there's quite a few other externalities. In a crowded urban area, vehicle use has a noise externality. If any of you have ever lived near a freeway or a busy road, as I have, you do get used to it after a while, but it certainly there's a noise effect there. That's known as noise pollution. So that's a second type of externality. The third type of externality is related to accidents. We know that as highways get busier, the likelihood of accidents does increase pretty significantly. So that's a third externality. And lastly, there's a congestion externality. So when I decide to drive on a road, I do consider for myself, is the road busy, is the road not busy? But probably what I don't consider, or the external effect, is the fact that by adding my car, each additional car on the road tends to slow down everybody else. So my decision to utilize a car to drive on a road doesn't just affect me, it imposes a lot of costs on other people as well. Doesn't mean I shouldn't do it. I may have an important trip I need to take, but it does impose some other costs. So in that sort of situation, it actually improves the economy to have a tax on car travel. Normally economists will say, gee, when we have sales and income taxes, that hurts the economy, that distorts the economy, that reduces economic growth. But having a tax that internalizes externalities actually raises revenue and improves economic growth and improves the economy. And our research showed that in most states, motor fuel tax rates were lower than the level of externality that drivers create when they use their vehicles. In other words, there's room to raise motor fuel tax rates at the state level, even after our recent increase. Now, we're not recommending that we go ahead and do that right away. We just had an increase here in Nebraska. But it is something we have potential to do in the future. Again, a tax increase that isn't necessarily bad for the economy. Highway tolls on congested roads are another example of a tax or fee increase that's a positive thing for the economy. And the arguments are similar, particularly related to the congestion externality. A third option relates to user access fees. Now, I can't say that that's a positive for the economy, but if you're going to raise additional revenue besides with motor fuel tax rates and congestion tolls, one of the best ways to do it, the least distorting ways to do it, is with user access fees. So these are flat fees that are charged per vehicle because that vehicle is going to use and have access to our state or local transportation system. The tax is not based on how much you actually use the transportation system. It shouldn't be based on how valuable your vehicle is, but just a flat fee that all drivers pay, an access fee. So at the state level, some of the registration fees work like that. Others are more based on the value of the vehicle, but the ones that are flat and fixed per vehicle would meet that definition. At the local level here in Lincoln, and I believe Omaha and some other cities in the state, they have something called a wheel tax that also meets that definition. So that's another relatively economically sensible way to raise additional revenues by raising those sorts of fixed access fees. Lastly, you can raise revenue from landowners who might benefit from highway infrastructure. This is having a kind of a little bit like tax increment finance, where the beneficiaries whose land values are likely to rise because of the investment perhaps would pay additional taxes, or some of the taxes they pay will be allocated to help pay for highway investments, whether that's new investments or maintaining bridges and roads. So there are some options available to raise additional revenue. Okay, now we're ready for our first poll question. I see a few of you have already answered, but I'll go ahead and announce it anyway. This is looking at metro versus non-metro areas, or if you're more comfortable with these terms, urban versus rural areas. Not exactly the same thing, but the two are related. Has per capita spending on highway construction been growing faster in metro or non-metro areas around the United States? What would you guess? And again, we're talking about per capita spending, so adjusting for the population growth. Faster in metro areas, faster in non-metro areas, or there's a slight difference, but it's about the same. So go ahead and think about your answer, and I'll present a little bit more information. In just a moment. Looks like we've had almost everyone vote, so I'm going to go ahead and reveal some relevant information. So we're going to look at the issue of growth in highway construction spending. Now, there is a lot of federal spending, but a lot of the federal revenue gets passed down to the states and supports state spending. And then local governments will raise transportation revenue themselves, but then will also receive pass downs from the state level that and federal level that supports local highway spending or highway construction spending. So when you're looking at construction spending and whether it's occurring in urban and rural areas, you sort of have two buckets. When the state allocates its dollars and directly spends on projects, to what extent are they spending in urban or rural areas? And then with local governments, you can look at, well, are the urban local governments obtaining and spending more money, or is it the rural local governments that are doing that on a per capita basis? So unfortunately, detailed data on the state spending patterns are not widely available, so you have to look at special studies. We found two especially relevant ones that I wanted to share with you. One study from Ohio found that average state highway construction spending per vehicle mile traveled, so per each vehicle on the road driving 1 mile, was actually 25% greater in rural counties than it was in Ohio's urban counties during the 1990 to 2008 period. In other words, per vehicle, the spending was greater in rural counties or non-metropolitan areas than it was in urban counties. There was a similar result from another study in Kansas for the year 2015. So again, on a per vehicle mile traveled basis, spending was greater in the non-metropolitan areas. With that Kansas study, it was also possible to look at the issue per lane mile rather than per vehicle mile traveled. So we know that on average, rural roads are less busy than urban roads. So some argue the relevant measure isn't per vehicle mile traveled, it's per lane mile that needs to be maintained. And sure enough, in Kansas, spending on highway construction was less per lane mile in the non-metropolitan areas than it was in the metropolitan areas. There's a much more consistent and better data available on local government spending on highway construction from the Census of Governments. And this primarily means county and city spending on highway construction. There is a little bit of school district spending in some special cases and other types of local governments, but it's really city and county that make up the lion's share. And so what we did is we looked at the Census of Government data. This is actually quite an involved effort, but we boiled it down to the main point here. And we looked at the growth in local government spending on highway construction between 2002 and 2012, with 2012 being the year where we had the most available data. And what we see is, in terms of local government spending on, at least on highway construction, the per capita spending is greater in metropolitan counties. However, that gap has been closing. So from 51 to 64% dollars per capita was the growth in metro spending between 2002 and 2012, but in that's about $13. In non-metropolitan counties, it went from 32 to 50, an $18 increase. And in percentage terms, certainly a faster increase. So I saw that in the responses to the last poll question, the participants in this webinar had it about right, correctly anticipating that there was faster spending growth on a per capita basis in the non-metropolitan counties, the non-metropolitan areas. And sure enough, that was right. So there is more spending per capita on construction in the urban areas. Perhaps that makes sense when you have a per vehicle mile traveled perspective, or but doesn't make sense if you have a per lane mile perspective. But the good news is the non-metropolitan areas are catching up in terms of per capita spending on highway construction. All right, I'm going to go ahead and ask you the last question. We won't get to this for a little bit, but the question is highway spending an investment? In other words, does our spending meet that definition of investment that I shared with you at the beginning of the webinar? We gave 4 responses, potential responses: always, not always, but overall. In other words, we looked at all the projects. We'd say it did overall. Not always, but sometimes. So it doesn't always, but it often meets the definition of an investment. And then some might answer rarely. It rarely meets that definition. So go ahead and think about your answer, and we'll uncover some information about that a little bit down the road here in the webinar. So I want to get back a little bit to the issue I was discussing earlier. You recall that we had found that non-metropolitan counties, the highway spending per person was growing faster in the recent decade in the non-metropolitan counties. So that's kind of a good sign. I know one thing we worry about is, do states and local governments allocate enough investment to highway construction in non-metropolitan areas? And there's some evidence that they're doing better in recent years in that regard. Now, it's actually even more interesting than that. So once we got that main result for non-metropolitan counties, we went and broke it down by type of non-metropolitan county. We broke non-metropolitan counties into 4 groups. The first breakdown had to do with how large the non-metropolitan county was. Now, some non-metropolitan counties, they don't have big cities, but they might have a small city or a large town, a community with a population of at least 10,000 people, but less than 50,000 people. If they reach 50,000, they might be reclassified as a metropolitan area, much as Grand Island was in recent years. But if you're over 10,000, if you have a town of over 10,000 people, but below 50, you're still a non-metropolitan county, but you're known as a micropolitan county of a small agglomerate, a small town, a small city, a micropolitan. So we broke up the non-metropolitan counties, which ones were micropolitan and which ones were not. The second thing we looked at is sort of where were the counties situated relevant to existing metropolitan areas. Are you adjacent to a metropolitan area, or are you a truly remote non-metropolitan county, not near any metro areas? So we sort of had 4 categories there. Remote micropolitan counties, remote small counties, micropolitan counties that are adjacent to a metropolitan area. Fremont and Beatrice in Nebraska would be examples of that. Or a small county without a town of 10,000 that is adjacent to a metropolitan area. So those were the 4 categories. So let me show you some of the results. You can look at the first one. If we look at micropolitan counties that are adjacent to a metro area, so in the Nebraska context, Beatrice and Fremont, real annual growth in local highway construction spending was pretty tepid in those places from 2002 to 2012. Similarly, smaller, we're calling them other non-metropolitan rather than micropolitan, other non-metropolitan, those smaller non-metropolitan counties but that are adjacent to a metro area, they also had slower growth and maybe average growth around 2.4% per year in real terms. So they were doing well, and interestingly enough, it was the smallest counties where the growth was the fastest. Now, what we also found was that growth in non-metropolitan county spending on highway construction was much stronger in the remote counties, the counties that are not near a metropolitan area. And we found that the larger remote counties that did have that town of at least 10,000, so think about Scotts Bluff, think about North Platte, think about Norfolk, just to give some examples. They had real growth in per capita highway construction spending of over 5% per year during this period, this recent period. And it was up to 7% a year for your small, remote, non-metropolitan counties. So that led to the conclusion I had in the preceding slide, which is when given the opportunity, so there's no federal rules that prevent it, state and local governments appear very willing and able to increase their spending on rural highways. So I think that should give some comfort to those who'd like to see more or faster growth in spending on rural highway construction. Okay, let's get to our last issue now. Is highway construction spending investment? Does it meet the definition of investment that I gave you earlier? Recall that a highway investment was a highway construction project where the public benefits in terms of safer, faster, and less expensive travel were large enough, and you receive those benefits every year, and the present value of those benefits is large enough that it exceeds the cost of the highway construction project. if that's true, then it's an investment. And there's a technique called benefit cost investment, where benefit cost analysis, where you estimate the present value of those benefits, divide it by the costs, and see if the ratio is more than one. In other words, the benefits of the project outweighed the costs. Anyway, is highway construction spending an investment? Well, if highway construction spending is consistently a good investment, we should see some evidence of that in economic growth data. In other words, where spending occurs, or where spending is rapid on highway infrastructure, we should expect to see an increase in the productivity of the private sector that's also strong, and also faster economic growth. So we can go look at evidence regarding highway construction spending over the last 30, 40 years and see if it meets that standard. There's a very important study that looked at spending from the late 1940s through the 1990s, and in particular broke it down into two periods. First of all, it looked at the effect of spending on the original Eisenhower highway system, where the construction started after World War II, and it was designed to build the first interstate highway network between all the major cities of the United States. And the research found that spending on the original Eisenhower highway system, the original network that was created, was highly productive, increased the productivity of the U.S. economy substantially all the way through 1973. However, as of 1973, that spending, that basic infrastructure, that basic network had been completed. Nonetheless, what we found was the spending continued, and the government at all levels continued to have significant levels of investment in that system, beyond just maintaining it, making sure that it was staying in good working order, but actually expanding the network into additional cities. And what the research found is the spending after 1973 on the interstate highway system did not significantly increase economic productivity or economic growth. So highway construction can be an investment, and a highly productive investment, but there's no guarantee that it will be. It kind of depends on the project. And just because a type of spending was productive in the past doesn't mean it will be in the future. There's also some interesting research looking specifically at the issue of investing in rural highway spending. And what that found was that investment in rural highways also did not seem to yield rapid growth in productivity or faster economic growth. In fact, the spending tended to reallocate economic activity between rural counties and between industries. Basically, if you look at a multi-county rural region, the highway investments didn't cause the overall region to grow more quickly, but it did tend to draw or concentrate the businesses, the economic activity in the region along the highway. So the classic example would be a small town that had 2 or 3 restaurants. After the highway is built, several of those restaurants move out to the highway instead of the downtown, so that they can capture both the local restaurant patrons, but also people driving by in their cars on the interstate. That's a reallocation. There also is something of a reallocation by industry. It is true that the manufacturing sector does tend to grow faster in counties that have these highway transportation investments, but it's less clear that some of the other sectors grow, and some indeed may shrink. So if you just look at the record and the economic research, there's, circumstantial evidence that highway construction spending is sometimes a beneficial investment, but not always. However, that's circumstantial evidence. And so in our project, we actually looked at some specific planned rural highway construction projects in 6 states. So these are things that were in the transportation plans of the state, had been scheduled to be just a few years in the future, and were likely to happen assuming sufficient revenue was around. And we looked at these 20 rural highway construction projects. and basically did a benefit cost analysis of each one of them. I wish I could have done 100, but obviously doing 20 benefit cost studies is quite an effort in and of itself. What we found was that about half, 11 of the 20 projects, had, by our calculation, a benefit cost ratio which exceeded 1.0, indicating that the benefits exceeded the costs in terms of the public benefits of faster, safer, and less costly travel. On the other hand, 9 projects you could not say that about. And so to answer the poll question, I see the most common response was not always, but overall. I think the group is right that it's kind of in that in-between area there. I would say it's a little closer to not always, but sometimes. So highway investment is sometimes very productive and a good, highway spending is sometimes very productive and a good investment, but often not. And it really comes down to project selection. The critical thing is to focus our spending on only, or at least primarily, those projects that are good investments, where the benefits to the traveling public are so large as to benefit, as to justify the money that is spent. And obviously that requires any time that money is spent on highways, certainly in Nebraska, and I think in many places around the country, there's a lot of careful deliberation, a lot of careful planning and analysis. All I'm saying is let's do even more of that in terms of analyzing each project to make sure that those benefits are going to exceed the costs, in all cases, or perhaps there'll be certain cases where we'll waive that criteria, but try to focus on that more in the process, in the project selection process. And that leaves me my last point, which is, do we need to increase highway spending to increase highway investment? Perhaps not. Perhaps we can increase investment in our highway infrastructure without raising spending. And the key to that, of course, is to use benefit cost analysis even more in project selection to ensure that all or nearly all the projects that are chosen are projects where the benefits exceed the costs. Okay, so those were the main points we wanted to make in the webinar. I do want to give another few moments to see what questions you may have. While you're thinking of questions, let me advertise our upcoming webinar, which will be on April 28th. Seems like a long time from now, but it'll be here before you know it. We're going to look at the producer services industry. These are businesses that provide services to other businesses. Think accounting firms, think consultants, think computer programmers, law firms, etc. And this is a very important industry. It's one of the fastest growing high wage parts of the economy. So we're going to analyze how this industry has been doing in Nebraska in the most recent years, following up on a series of studies we've done over the last 5 to 10 years. So that'll be coming on Friday, April 28th. Hope you're able to join us at that time. Still waiting to see if any questions come up, but certainly they may or may not. And certainly I want to thank everyone for participating in today's webinar and for answering the poll questions and for your attention. I hope it was worthwhile for you. I'll also mention that there's many ways which you can keep up with BBR, Bureau of Business Research, here at the College of Business Administration, and receive our research on the state of economy. We're putting out, we have 2 monthly reports we put out on the state economy, leading economic indicator, and surveys of business and consumer confidence. We also have periodic reports about the economy that are coming out all the time. So you can follow what's going on with the Bureau on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. You can see how to follow us there on those 3 platforms. You can also subscribe to our e-newsletter by sending your preferred email address to bbr@unl.edu. So let me again thank everyone for participating today. If you do have a follow-up question that occurs to you later, feel free to contact us. Otherwise, have a great month, and we hope you'll be able to join us for our webinar on April 28th. Thank you again.